Frank Dikotter examines Mao's Great Leap Forward, which took place from 1958 to 1962, using the recently opened Communist Party archives. Professor Dikotter reports that between those years, at least 45 million Chinese were killed. He speaks at the Asia Society in New York City for about an hour, 20 minutes.
It's a great honor to begin my time at the Asia Society with an important and difficult book like this one. So we've asked Professor Dikotter to begin our discussion tonight by giving us a short reading, as Michael said. I think anybody writing about a subject as huge and difficult to comprehend as the Great Leap Forward inevitably needs to find a way to make it somehow intelligible and begin to break it down and write about it. And Professor Dikotter has taken a kind of mosaic approach. He uses the rich and often ghastly detail that he's painstakingly unearthed in archives across China to come at the disaster on a number of different scales, from the world of internal leadership politics in Beijing and Cold War diplomacy and trade, that's on the large scale, to the fates of individual villages and farmers on the small scale. And what emerges is a picture of a country convulsed not just by hunger. In fact, the word famine is in some ways inadequate to describe what happened, but convulsed by monumental dislocations of lives, of ideas, of nature, of morals, of reason, and about just about everything that held society together. Toward the end of the book, he describes several places that he calls sites of horror, where the toll of these convulsions was especially brutal and where the sources give us an especially vivid picture of that brutality. And he's going to begin with one of these.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. I discovered a lot during these 4 years of research on the Great Leap Forward. I spent about 6 months in archives collecting an extraordinary array of material, from Public Security Bureau reports to investigations into mass murder, confessions by people who presided over the deaths of literally millions, as well as sometimes letters written by ordinary people. All along, I knew quite well that there were other great mass murderers in the 20th century. Joseph Stalin comes to mind, Adolf Hitler as well, and then of course there is Pol Pot. It is often said that Pol Pot killed 1.7 million to 2.4 million people in a country of about 8 million, and that constitutes the greatest mass murder of the 20th century. It is sometimes said that nothing similar ever happened in China because it's such a large country. Well, I'm going to read you about one place. I have no more than two and a half pages on this place. You'll find out that the numbers correspond to Cambodia. Cambodia, 8 million people. Estimates of 1.7 to 2.4 million people died in that country. Let me read you about Fuyang. I'm half blind, so I'm going to have to look over my glasses. Nothing was as bad as Anhui, run by Zheng Xisheng, one of Mao's most devoted followers. Like other provinces, Anhui was divided into regions, having over a dozen. One of these regions was Fuyang. Fuyang had a population of 8 million in 1958. 3 years later, more than 2.4 million people had died. One of the reasons for the high death rate was the landscape itself. Flat and generally barren, it offered few places to hide. Many of those who wanted to flee the area followed the river into Xinjiang in neighboring Henan, where the famine was even worse. The Huai River itself was a web of death. In 1957, it became the focus of a huge irrigation project which commanded up to 80% of the labor force. Every hectare would have a duct every 10 hectares a canal, and every 100 hectares a large waterway. Fields would be as smooth as a mirror, deep ploughing making the soil as pliable as dough. Fuyang would catch up with the future in a mere year or two. Slogans such as, "In daytime we fight the sun, at night we battle the stars," were behind the ceaseless exploitation of the best workers along the river. Many succumbed to disease, exhaustion, and death. To prevent workers from returning home over the Chinese New Year, the militia sealed their homes. With the inexorable advance of dams, dikes, and channels, everything in the way was flattened. Trees, graves, even large bridges were torn down, forcing farmers to walk for several kilometers each day to attend to the fields. Entire villages were compelled to relocate overnight at the whim of a carder. Hundreds simply vanished from the map. Other giant schemes took away the best workers from the fields before the sowing or reaping was even completed. So abundant was the crop, the party line went, that grain should be turned into alcohol. Hao County built more than 3,200 alcohol factories in January 1959. Less than half of it worked, and many tons of grain went to waste. Just as ruinous were efforts to mechanize agriculture. Clunky iron wheels were added to some 10,000 carts, which were so heavy that bulls could no longer pull them. To compound the problem, the old carts were banned from the roads, and farmers seen to use them were denounced as rightists. The grain output plunged, but zealous carders doubled it on paper. Punitive requisitions followed. Carried out with routine violence, they sometimes extracted close to 90% of the actual crop. To compensate for the shortage in grain, carders burst into local households and carried away tables, chairs, and beds. Farmers were even forced to turn in a set amount of cotton clothes, up to several kilos per family. Failure to fulfill the quota led to a ban from the canteen. Zhao Huairen had to hand over the cotton jackets of his 70-year-old mother and his child. In the freezing cold, they had to bury themselves underneath some straw to keep warm. By 1960, there was so little left to collect that in one commune, the biggest hall consisted of 100 coffins. Torture was rampant. Iron wire was used to pierce the ears of bad elements, while women were stripped and suspended by their hair. In Linquan, the use of violence was summarized as follows by the party boss. And here I quote, "People died in tragic circumstances, being beaten and hanged to death, deprived of food, or buried alive. Some were severely tortured and beaten, having their ears chopped off, their noses dug out, their mouths torn off, and so on, which often caused death. We discovered how extremely serious all of this was once we started investigating," unquote. Murder was common. In Dahuangzhuang, a small village in Linquan, 9 out of 19 carders had killed at least one villager during the famine. Li Fengying, a team leader, killed 5 people. In some cases, villagers were deliberately entrapped. In late 1959, at the height of the famine, one of the food processing factories belonging to the local grain bureau in Funan County left bean cakes in a courtyard with the gates wide open. As starving farmers tried to pilfer the food, the gates were suddenly locked behind them. I quote, "Some of those who were caught were forced into a grain sack that was tied at the end. Then they were beaten with iron bars. The sacks were covered in blood. Others had their faces carved by knives and then oil rubbed into the wounds," unquote. Help for the famished was withheld. 15 tons of grain sent to support those in need in one county alone were confiscated, hastening the deaths of thousands. People also died when the local authorities tried to hide the famine from inspection teams. The militia, for instance, were instructed to seal off the villages and not to allow anyone with signs of starvation on to the streets. in one commune targeted for a visit by the Ministry of Interior in 1960, the county had scrambled to round up and hide more than 3,000 villagers with edema. Locked up without any medical support, several hundred died in a matter of days. A local cadre had a quick look at Qin Zhonghuai, who was one of those suffering from edema. "He won't live. Bury him quickly," he ordered, as an inspection team was on the way. "He was still breathing while being buried," concluded the local party secretary. That's it. We'll now sit down and continue.
So before we start our discussion, I just want to mention that that this book will be on sale at the end of this event, and Professor Dikotter will be signing copies of it when we finish. So much of the book is about how the country got to a place like Fuyang. And to get there, you begin in Beijing in 1953 with Mao Zedong's reaction to the death of Stalin. You don't call the book China's Great Famine, you call it Mao's Great Famine. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you begin the story there, what was happening in the Chinese leadership.
There are reasons why the Great Leap Forward starts by the end of 1957. And one of the greatest reasons is the death of a man called Joseph Stalin. The death of Stalin is Mao's liberation. For a very long time, Mao has been very much indebted to Stalin. And he sees himself as the real leader of the socialist camp. Think about it. Stalin never led the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin did. Mao sees himself as somebody who brought a quarter of humanity to what he describes as liberation. Mao is the one, unlike Stalin, who fought the Americans to a standstill in the Korean War. After Mao's death, a rather rotund and awkward man called Khrushchev succeeds him. And Mao has very little respect for that particular person. Now, when he goes to Moscow in 1957, and Khrushchev openly proclaims that the Soviet Union is going to overtake the United States in the production of butter, milk, and other dairy products, Mao jumps in and says, we will overtake England. You may overtake the United States, but we will overtake England, still seen as a major power, within 15 years. He stakes his own prestige on that great leap forward from socialism into communism. But most of all, of course, what Mao really wishes to demonstrate is not so much the ability of the country to overtake England, but to actually outdo the Soviets, to show that Mao, and not Khrushchev or Stalin in the past, has discovered that bridge to communism. And what is that bridge? The people's communes. Mao sees the real wealth of the country in hundreds of millions of farmers in the countryside. If only they could be harnessed, if only everything could be collectivized, if every man could work like a soldier in a continuous revolution, tackling one task after the other, surely the country could be catapulted past the Soviet Union and all the others. It is Mao's Great Famine because he's the one who initiates this, and he's the one who very much makes sure that number 2, 3, 4, everybody down the line will actually support him in that. The first thing he does is purge the party, as tens of thousands of cadres who are unwilling to actually go along with the Great Leap Forward are taken out and are replaced by hard, unscrupulous men willing to benefit from the radical winds that blow from Beijing. Something else he does is take to task not so much number 2, Liu Shaoqi, who very much supports the Great Leap Forward, but number 3, Zhou Enlai. In public meetings in front of other leaders, he demeans them, humiliates them, makes him write his self-confession 2-3 times until Zhou Enlai himself finally falls in line and declares his full support for the Great Leap Forward and his dying admiration for Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong is the one who pushes it. Mao Zedong is also the one who allows it to stop by stepping back in 1961.
And so maybe it would be helpful to walk us through the first few months or years of how Mao's actions ramified on a local level. How did it begin?
It begins in Moscow as Khrushchev somehow wishes to enter into friendly competitive bidding with the United States. This is where Mao very much starts his whole idea of a great leap forward past the Soviet Union and possibly even England. But the key point is really the winter of 57 and 58. Often we think about the people's communes as the key moment, but it is precisely during the winter of 57-58 that Mao sees an opportunity to use these hundreds of millions of farmers during the slack season to transform the face of China by having them work day in, day out on massive irrigation projects. One of the myths that one can find in the literature about this period is that in 1958 there was this great enthusiasm for the Great Leap Forward, and death and hunger only starts to creep in by the end of 1958, possibly early 59. But people die as early as February 1958. There is a county, Yunnan province, where tens of thousands of people die of overwork, exhaustion, disease, and famine by the summer of 1958 in Yunnan province. Why? Because villagers are being herded into these collectives, their land is being taken away, their tools, their utensils, their livelihood, their cattle, everything is collectivized, and nothing but the stick remains to force these people to go to these irrigation projects and work. These irrigation projects are often very far away from the village. They're not being given enough food. They have to sleep outside. Mao's doctor, Li Jisui, actually writes about this himself. As a privileged person, he has to spend 2 weeks working on an irrigation project just outside Peking, and his back is broken after 2 weeks. This is a privileged carver who then goes back to have a nice bath in Beijing. These farmers have to work for weeks on end. They are exhausted, given insufficient food, literally driven to overwork themselves to death. So the horror starts very much in the beginning. That's one of the key dates. Another key date is a year later, in the summer of 1959, when a number of key influential people, including General Peng Dehuai, actually speak out against the Great Leap Forward, creating a backlash, meaning that Mao pushes even harder with yet another purge of cadres who are unwilling to go along with that vision of a leap into communism. And then probably the end of it is by 1960. By the time we reach October 1960, so many tens of millions of people have died unnecessarily, often in violent conditions, as the 2 pages on Fuyang show. The transportation system has creaked to a halt. There are tons of grain literally rotting by the roadside, left uncollected because there's no fuel, while farmers eat the plaster from the wall, sometimes even mud, in order to somehow get by. October 1960, the leadership is for the first time willing to look at the catastrophe in its full scope. And very gradually through 1961, Mao allows some of his some of his key players to reintroduce a measure of the free market, a measure of liberty, a measure of movement. By 1962, the Great Leap Forward is pretty much abandoned.
To get back to the earlier period, one of the things that surprised me in reading this was that the famine actually begins with this bizarre period of feasting, of politically mandated gluttony, when the state is claiming that there are such intense surpluses that people should be consuming them in larger and larger quantities. Why did that happen?
On the ground, local cadres, party officials are trying to outdo each other in fulfilling and over-fulfilling the latest command that comes from above, producing quotas that are out of all relationship with what is actually being produced on the ground. Now, if there is so much grain, as Mao seems and others seem to believe by the summer of 1958, then the big question is, what are we going to do with it? It seems like an absurd question, but when Khrushchev visits Peking in the summer of 1958 and is taken to the swimming pool by Mao Zedong for a little chit-chat. Of course, Khrushchev is very much unable to swim and sits by the side of the pool watching Mao Zedong going up and down. He is told that China's real problem is that there's so much grain. What should we do with it? And Khrushchev doesn't say anything. Stays very quiet. Think, how can you produce so much grain? And we all work very hard, and there's never quite enough to feed everybody. How can you possibly claim there's too much grain? But that's the official slogan. There's too much grain. So why not feast? This is very much Mao's command. Have 5 meals a day. But on the other hand, of course, the villagers by the summer of 1958 have already seen so much of their labor, of their homes, of their tools confiscated by the party, that they see here an opportunity to really get back what is, in effect, their own. After all, these public canteens, these public dormitories, these public kindergartens have been set up with their tools, with their furniture, with their bricks. The food inside these canteens is a result of their labor. So what can they do? They tuck in, they eat, they feast, they try to eat as much as they can to get something back in the full knowledge that all of it one day will be gone.
And there's a sort of parallel story that you tell of the state's own appetites at this moment for industrial machinery and for various other things that China is purchasing internationally and paying for in grain. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about China's trade at this moment and how that affected the famine.
In 1958, China buys so much equipment, entire factories from the Soviet Union, that when the bills come in by December, well, they have to be paid. But by December 1958, the leadership starts realizing that all these targets, all these quotas, all these digits on paper don't quite correspond to the reality. The grain output is much lower. Zhou Enlai, the one who was so reluctant to go along, at this point in time has become absolutely crucial in actually fulfilling, implementing that vision that Mao has about a leap forward into communism. He's the first one to say that he would rather not eat than not honor foreign contracts. Deng Xiaoping jumps in and says, look, if every man, every woman could eat less meat, less grain, then we could repay our debt to the Soviet Union in no time. Mao Zedong himself envisages a country from which meat would be banned, export all of it. So there is a myth that somehow By the end of 1958, the leadership prudently steps back. But this is quite, it's not at all what you see in the very detailed minutes of top leadership meetings. On March 25th, a few months later, 25 of March 1959, Mao goes so far as to say in a top secret meeting that let half the people die, provided the other half can eat their fill. He makes it very clear that grain procurements should not so much decrease, but increase up to 30% of all the grain in order to meet these foreign commitments and repay the debt to the Soviet Union. He makes available extra trucks to make sure that these grain procurements can actually be carried out.
Why? Why is that the priority?
It is more important for Zhou Enlai and other of the top leaders to save face than it is to save lives. There is a slogan with which Mao comes up on that meeting of the 25th March 1959. He who strikes first prevails. When I read that slogan in these minutes, which I found in a very remote provincial archives in Gansu province, I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. Till later on, I came across another document that was dated a few months later, June 59. And here we have Tan Zhenlin, a man who's very much responsible for agriculture, explain that saying to some of his subordinates. Tan Zhenlin explains that he who strikes first means that the party, the state, should get to the grain before the farmers actually get their hands on it. And he explains that this particular saying should not be used below the level of county head because it might lead to misunderstandings. Tan Zhenlin is also the man who very much takes to task those who somehow are timid about beating the grain out of farmers. This is the beautiful thing about these archives. You get direct quotations. What does he say? He says, if you are afraid of waging war on the farmers, then there is something ideologically wrong with you. So what I'm trying to say here is that even before the summer of 1959, when most historians see a backlash against Peng Dehuai and others who speak out against the Great Leap Forward, even before the summer of 1959, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, others are very much aware of the fact that they are taking far too much grain from the countryside and that it has to be done by force, by coercion.
So on the one hand, you paint a picture of a party leadership that's all-powerful, that can compel people to behave in these unthinkable ways toward one another and rip whole communities apart. On the other hand, you have some very intriguing details about the extent to which the chaos and the famine spread even into the leadership compound in Beijing. And Mao's doctor notes that there are people who are malnourished even within the walls of Zhongnanhai, where Mao lives. You describe the building of the Great Hall of the People and the fact that it was very difficult to get workers to show up to the job, that they were engaging the same kinds of acts of sabotage and shoddy workmanship that were happening in other parts of the country. How do you reconcile this sort of all-powerful hand at the local level and then the inability to control it so close to the center?
Mao, Chairman Mao, does his very best to set the tone at the top. And in these public rituals of humiliation of leaders who do not quite follow the command that comes from him, he sets the tone and makes sure that the right people get into the right key positions. These people in turn do very much adopt the very same strategy. This is not a party where you apply for membership. This is a party where you get purged. On the ground, local cadres are under great pressure to fulfill and overfulfill constantly changing targets, quotas, numbers, digits. In other words, they're being replaced by people who are quite willing to go along with whatever command comes from Peking because there are benefits to be obtained. On the other hand, ordinary people outside of the party know very well that this is a dysfunctional system and that in order to survive, they must learn in order to get through all this violence, the violence of collectivization, the violence of food procurement by the state, and the misery of starvation, in order to somehow get by and try to survive, ordinary people have to rely on their wits. They have to steal, pilfer, forage, smuggle, charm, or otherwise outwit the state and its representatives. And in fact, it isn't just ordinary people who bend every rule in the book. Everybody all the way to the top tries to somehow manipulate this system in order to get by and further one's own career. So on the one hand, there's an image on paper of a command economy in which everything is determined at the top by a man called Li Fuchun. He's the master planner, which shows or commands how much of each particular good should produce by whom, when, and where. Yet the reality is that everybody somehow is trying to bend the rules. And that kind of environment in which the rule of survival pretty much dominates, the ability to bend these rules for ordinary people is very much linked to the ability to actually survive.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that you take issue with some recent scholarship on the Great Leap that looks at these acts of trickery, of wetting grain to meet a quota, or welding shoddy railroad ties, or robbing the state granary. There are scholars who've considered this a kind of heroic action of righteous resistance of the people against the state. You argue the picture is not so black and white, that, you know, since food was finite, one individual's gain is another's loss. You know, if you put sand in the grain, the guy down the line at the factory from you is going to have to eat that, and it's really a much murkier moral universe.
Indeed. You see, about 1/3 of the book is about ways of surviving. I read a few pages about a site of horror where death is dominant. But throughout the country, of course, many more people manage to survive. They try to somehow survive by not working at work. Farmers, as soon as the party official walks through the field, drop their tools, sit down and wait for the day to be over in order to somehow preserve some energy. They go into the fields and take spikes of grain before it's even reaching maturity. They will eat the grain raw, green. Shippers will somehow use bamboo tubes that go straight into grain sacks, suck out the grain, replace it with sand. At every level, people are trying to somehow get by stealing a potato, by pilfering something, by walking away with a handful of grain that doesn't belong to them. One has to. In this kind of universe, with mass starvation, the only one way to survive is to bend the rules to some extent. There are all sorts of strategies of survival. In some cases where, for instance, the local leadership might actually side with the villagers. Very powerful forms of resistance develop, where, for instance, the village head will keep 2 books. There is a book to account for the grain, that is for the eyes of the grain inspector. And there's another book which is for the eyes of the villagers. A lot of the grain is actually hidden behind walls, under floorboards, into coffins. When the state goes out, as I described earlier on in 1959, and actually tries to get to the grain, he who strikes first prevails, that's the saying by Mao. That's actually what happens. people do try to hide as much as they can. Sometimes as individuals, sometimes among families, sometimes entire villages manage to get through. So these forms of resistance are extremely interesting and show the full scope of human behavior in times of agony, pain, and loss on a massive scale. But it's not quite right, I believe, to describe these acts as heroic acts of resistance against a state. It reminds me of the words of Primo Levi, who managed to survive through Auschwitz and then went on to write some very profound books about what it means to actually survive through horror. And he was very much the first one to say that he was not a hero for having survived. If anything, the heroes were dead, because he himself had to undergo all sorts of routine degradations and make all sorts of moral compromises in order to somehow get by. For instance, by not sharing a handful of food that he might have discovered. And it's very much the same picture here. To steal from the state seems heroic. To replace grain in a sack by sand seems like a good strategy. But somehow, somebody down the line in that public canteen will be chewing on grit and will probably die as a consequence. And bit by bit, as starvation becomes extensive, people turn against each other. They start stealing from neighbors. Families turn onto themselves. Here's Wang Jiuchang, a man who lives just outside Nanjing, and he systematically takes the grain from his 8-year-old daughter. And at some point, when it gets cold, he takes a cotton jacket and her trousers. This girl dies of pain and cold in the middle of the winter. So what Primo Levi said to describe what had happened in Auschwitz during the Second World War, he described it as a gray zone. And I would see China from 1958 to 62 as one giant gray zone.
I want to have a chance to get to your questions, but before we do that, I thought we could talk a little bit about how you did your research, how you uncovered stories like that. I mean, the whole use of archives, national, provincial, local, for the period after 1949 is something that's very new in the field of history, particularly for an event as politically sensitive as this one. How did you approach these archives? How were you received by the archivists? Were there other people in the archives? What was it like doing this research?
Well, I moved to Hong Kong some 4 or 5 years ago, and one can do wonderful things from Hong Kong. One of the things I started doing some 5 years ago was to take a little train. You can take a taxi to Kowloon railway station. You clear customs, of course, after you buy your coffee at Starbucks. You get on the train, and 2 hours later, you are in Guangzhou. And by about 9:40, 9:50, I would be in the Guangdong Provincial Archives, trying to see what was there. And of course, I've spent some 20 years working with archives in China, but pretty much most of it pre-1949, some 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that was the real cutting edge sort of research when archives on the Republican era were being opened up. I always kept my eye on that border post-49. So I was playing around with an idea about a project on everyday life. It was a very simple question. Here we have a people's republic, but what happened to the people? What do we actually know about people and how they lived and how they died, in particular during the Maoist era? And I quickly discovered that the period of the Great Leap Forward was actually very rich. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that none of the key terms used during this period sound particularly negative. The big taboo is Cultural Revolution. 1966 onwards, there's very little there. If you look at the earlier years in the archives, 1949 onwards, well, an awful lot of the political campaigns carry all sorts of quite negative connotations. I don't know whether you speak Chinese, but a lot of these movements are called Sanfan, Sufan, Zhenfan, Wufan, the three anti, the five anti, the anti-this, the anti-that. So, of course, it's material that appears to be more sensitive to the archivists. So that period there seemed extremely interesting. And on top of that, once I started in Guangdong, it was the start of a 4-year project that took me to all parts of China. And I think I benefited, as others did, from a sense of openness and willingness in the years that ran up to the Olympics. I think there was a sense that somehow the Olympics was a great occasion, and things ought to be easier, things ought to be eased up and opened up. So there was a great window of opportunity there. This is not to say that I just walked into an archive and said, could you please show me how many people died in this county?
So what did you
during
say?
the Great Leap Forward?
How did you explain what you were doing?
Well, I'm honest, I'm Dutch, that means I'm quite straightforward. I said I do economic history. And economic history is pretty much what it boils down to. How much grain is being produced, how much grain is being exported, how much grain is being procured. Hard economic history. And then, of course, once you start reading the material from economic history, it leads you to all sorts of other very interesting documents. But that's how I started off. In some places, there was a great willingness to show material, and in other places, I was asked to wait and drink tea for a couple of hours, and I was told in a very polite manner that there simply wasn't anything on my topic. So maybe I should go somewhere else, which I did.
So one of the main themes in your book and sort of this whole event is the extent of falsifying of official information that went on during this period. When you're in the archive and you see something like 67,000 people were clubbed to death with sticks, or in Diaofang commune, some 22,000 beams, trusses, and floorboards were torn out of people's homes overnight in a movement to mechanize the commune. The carts produced were so ramshackle that they fell to pieces the moment anyone tried to use one. How do you begin to go about verifying a story like that or a statistic like that?
The thing is, when we hear the term archive, it sounds rather boring, except if you're a historian like me, you become very excited by that term. But archives is more than just one thing. Archives is basically anything that was written down in some sort of official capacity is deposited in there. Now, like most one-party states, whether this is under Stalin, under Hitler, under Mao, leaders are very well aware of the fact that propaganda is absolutely essential. And that next to propaganda, a system has to be developed to find out what is really happening, quote unquote. So on the one hand, there's this massive amount of literature that's produced for propaganda purposes. And on the other hand, there is an extraordinary amount of inspectors, teams, secretaries sent by anybody in any capacity, sent down to investigate what is happening on the ground. And don't forget that from 1958 to 1962, an awful lot happens, including a number of purges. And every time there is a purge, every time the wind turns, so to speak, there's some sort of secret investigation carried out, for instance, by the Public Security Bureau. Now, you get a sense of what is written up for mere propaganda purposes and what is investigated down in order to find out what is actually happening on the ground. You get a good feel for that. The Public Security Bureau, in general, is not there to produce a quota. they may very well kill by quota, as in get rid of 5% of these people. But when they investigate mass murder, or when somebody has to write his own confession, you will see that the numbers tend to vary, that there are questions, that there are queries, and then they tend to coagulate at some point. So, of course, a lot of it is questionable. But in general, there's very little incentive for somebody who is, or a team who is investigating mass murder to actually increase the number of deaths or exaggerate the amount of torture. There's very little incentive to do that. It's the other way around.
What was the most surprising thing you found in the archives, in your research?
What took me aback right away, that was pretty much day one, is the extent of violence. The extent of violence. I expected to read about famine. I expected to read about deprivation, starvation. I didn't realize, rather naively I should say, that collectivization means collective violence. When you take away everything, when you strip every incentive to work from people, you have to literally beat them to get to do things. And the ways in which villages and cadres became so brutalized in parts of the countryside that it produced this mounting spiral of violence. I thought I was very much taken aback by it. And the sheer that arsenal of horror, the ways in which people were demeaned, the imagination of the few deployed to inflict pain and anguish on the many really took me aback. And it comes back in report after report after report after report. That really surprised me tremendously. And then I guess that, once in a while, one gets the feeling that there is a treasure trove. And that happened on one or two occasions. When for some reason the minutes of top leadership meetings were actually available right there in front of me. Minutes that have not been read, to my knowledge, by other historians.
This was in a provincial archive?
There's one provincial archive. If you read the book carefully, you will know which one it is. There's an extraordinary amount of very detailed minutes of who said what, when, and where, and how Mao sets the agenda, how he responds to some other views. Extremely interesting. And that allowed me really to link up not just the stories of ordinary people, which was my point of departure, but how these stories link into a much broader political framework. To link up, if you wish, the corridors of power with the lives of people in the countryside.
One link, interestingly, that you don't make as often is to any connection to historical forces prior to the 1950s. I mean, you're a historian of earlier periods. Do you see anything happening, not so much at the leadership level, but in Chinese society that created the conditions in which people could behave like this to one another, or do you really see it primarily as coming from the top down?
I wrote a little book, very short. It's called The Age of Openness, China Before Mao. And it describes the Republican era as a period of great openness in the circulation of ideas, people, institutions, objects move rather freely, a realm of relative freedom that is then subsequently closed down after 1949. So the real key period, I think, is 1949 to 57, the 10 years prior to the Great Leap Forward. And I'm working on that right now.
Okay. That was going to be another question. So one last question. I think there's anybody who has read a little bit about this period knows that an issue of major contention among scholars is what the death toll was of the Great Leap Forward. And your numbers are, I guess, about 50% higher than some recent studies that have come out of the mainland. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to them and why and how these numbers are important. I mean, in some ways they're so bafflingly huge that...
It's a good question, but let me just say one thing first. This is a regime that very much reduces people to mere digits on a balance sheet, that sees human beings as livestock. People have to be clothed, housed, fed, and all of that comes at a cost. So in many cases, people who are too weak, too vulnerable to actually contribute to the food supply are being deliberately starved to death, are banned from the canteen. So this is a regime that reduces people to numbers. I am not the one who wants to do the same thing again and only look at numbers. I think the task of the historian is really to discover the human stories behind this horror, and that's what the book tries to do. But it is true, there's one chapter that tries to look at the scope of this catastrophe, because it's unavoidable. I didn't set out to do it. It just so happens that over the course of these 4 years, I came across again and again, extremely detailed investigations, generally carried out by the Public Security Bureau, but sometimes by county party committees or even provincial party committees in 62, 63, 64, immediately in the aftermath of the famine, trying to find out how many people had died unnecessarily in some of these areas. For instance, here is the head of the Public Security Bureau in Sichuan province, a place which is about twice the size of France, who writes confidentially to Li Qingquan, the man who has presided over that province since the Great Leap Forward. And he tells him in a whole list of statistics that he has presided over the deaths of 8 to 10 million people. There's a secret document. There are quite a few similar ones. So what I did, I took those documents and I compared them to whatever statistics have been produced on the basis of official population numbers. So pretty much all the numbers, the estimates we have, are based on extrapolations on the basis of official population statistics. The documents I have are not official, haven't been published. I compared them and I discovered that there is a gap of 30, 40, 50%, sometimes 100%. So on that basis, I estimate that the number of 30 to 32 million that has been produced several times by a number of historical demographers would have to be increased by at least 50%. So I say it is at least 45 million people who died necessarily. It could be more. Let me add one little note, namely that a man called Chen Yizi was sent by another man called Zhao Ziyang before Tiananmen Square, before 1989, with the whole team of people into the archives to find out what had happened in the countryside. And Chen Yizi, who subsequently came to the United States, said that during their investigation of the archives, they had concluded that at least 45 million people had died during the Great Leap Forward. So my estimate very much corresponds to the team under Chen Yizi that went to similar archives in the 1980s. I still don't know what it means. I have no idea how you get your head around 45 million. It's mind-boggling. I've even started to understand what that means. I cannot imagine how much 45 million is.
At the end of the book, you touch briefly on the sort of high political legacy of this event, that there was a backlash in the leadership against Mao, and then that led to his being sort of sidelined and regrouping to come back with a vengeance during the Cultural Revolution. But how do you interpret the legacy of the Great Leap Forward for the rest of Chinese society, kind of in the short term and maybe even in the longer term?
Well, whatever legacy there is a very indirect one, in the sense that there is no public memory, there is no memorial, there is no museum. There's very little thinking and writing about this period, which is not to say, of course, that many people in the countryside have their memories and are sometimes quite keen to share them. As part of this book, there is a project, there's a team of people who went to the countryside to do insider interviewing, collecting memories of people all over the country. And these over 100 interviews are being transcribed and will be deposited with a public library. And there probably will be a book on that by my colleague, Zhou Xun. But beyond that, it seems to me that you cannot really understand this embrace, so to speak, of consumerism, quote unquote, not a word I particularly like, but nonetheless this embrace of consumerism today without understanding the extraordinary anguish, deprivation and pain during those years. Not entirely dissimilar to what happened in Europe after the Second World War. Once you've gone through that, once, for instance, in Holland, where I grew up, your parents had to eat tulip bulbs in 1945, you want to have a lot of meat on the table. You want to have a fridge, a car, a house, a very normal human impulse to actually focus on material goods. Although that, of course, also has a very convenient political aspect for the current leadership, which is precisely to focus on the material aspects of life at the expense of the political.
Interesting. All right, on that note, I think I'll open it up to questions from all of you. I've been asked to ask you that, first of all, you wait for the microphone before you ask a question. And second, that you stand up, if you can, and identify yourself before you ask your question. So maybe we'll start here in the front.
I'm Calvin Oba, a student on leave from Columbia. The death toll of 45 million from the Great Famine exceeds the communist government's own estimates of the number of Chinese who died at the hands of the Japanese. I think their figure is 35 million. So I find it very ironic that in the 20th century it's more likely, a Chinese was more likely to die at the hands of the other Chinese than at the hands of the Japanese.
You're quite right. I mentioned Pol Pot earlier on simply because the population in Cambodia is the same as the population in Phuong, that region I read on. And the number of deaths is actually higher in Phuong than it is in Cambodia. So you would have to take Pol Pot and Cambodia and multiply it by 20 in order to get roughly near what happened during the Great Leap Forward. It is just short of about 10 million of the total number of people who died worldwide during the Second World War. It's just an inconceivably large number of people. But you're quite right. Certainly after 1949, but the entire 20th century, the likelihood in China to be killed or starved deliberately to death by somebody else is much higher than being killed by a Japanese. Although to be fair, this is also quite true for, of course, Europe. Europeans are very good at killing each other.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and a very compelling book. I have two questions. The first question is your descriptions of getting access and actually getting the information is very interesting, and to a certain extent it seems like almost accidental research or a little bit hit and miss. As a historian, I'm interested in what's your impression of the extent to which your book follows Tombstone, Chinese language edition that came out in Hong Kong, that the party is allowing a certain amount of light to be shined in this corner. And to what extent do you think that means there will be more movement with regards to perhaps more exposure of what happened during the Cultural Revolution period? Are we seeing the beginnings of a trend, or is this an isolated corner that really doesn't have much to do with other issues?
I'm afraid I have bad news for you.
My second question is this:
Should we let's do one at a time.
China scholars, as a whole, tend, particularly during the current sort of political climate, have to be very careful about what they study and the depth and intensity of that study. I just wonder, to what extent do you feel you're vulnerable as a scholar now in terms of access to these types of archives in future? Do you feel that you might be vulnerable to a potential blacklist?
I have even more bad news for you. It was, of course, very tempting when I was there. Of course, I think all good historical scholarship is a little bit hit and miss. If you already know the answer to the questions you have, there's no point in carrying out the research. And on the other hand, if you can't really have the material that allows you to answer these questions, there's no point in doing it either. So I think as a historian, one is always attuned to the discovery of interesting, rich material that allows one then to ask interesting questions. But the key point really is that I too thought for a while that that law that allows the archivist to open up material that is older than 30 years would gradually increase the amount of material that is available. But with hindsight, I think that was rather naive, in the sense that my feeling now is that a lot of these places simply went a little bit too far in opening material. Or, in short, here's the bad news. Since the Olympics, a lot of that material has been reclassified. So today I would not be able to carry out the research for that book. I was there pretty much at the right time. Which is not to say that everything has been reclassified, but it's become much tougher. There's still very interesting material out there. It's become a lot tougher. Let us just hope. Let us just hope that over the coming years, the authorities in the People's Republic will adopt the same attitude as elsewhere, including in the ex-Soviet Union, by making it available more systematically. As to the second question, I don't really believe that I'm important enough to be banned from the People's Republic. You yourself quoted the book by Yang Qisheng, who's done a very interesting groundwork in a book on the famine. There are others who have published on it. I'm not really the first. I don't think that something that happened 50, 60 years ago is sufficiently important to warrant a ban. And in fact, given the number of emails I get from people in the mainland who are very keen to read the translation that will be published by Bao Pu, the son of Bao Tong, the editor of the Zhao Ziyang Memoirs, given that a translation will become available in a few months' time, and given the number of emails I get from readers who are very interested in it, maybe I will even be welcomed.
Yes.
Is there any evidence of any, in other countries they have food riots, or, non-communist countries, they have food riots in response to something like this. Is there any evidence, is this on? Can you hear it? Yeah. Is there any evidence that there were any revolts among the people, and if so, what happened to them?
Yes, it's a wonderful question. I did talk about strategies of coping. Theft in particular, lying, obstructing, cheating, pilfering, stealing, smuggling. But at some point, in these villages, it does happen that passive, that shield that outsiders, that protective shield that outsiders mistake for passivity and submissiveness actually breaks down, and farmers become really violent. In one county in Hunan province, out of 500 granaries, about 30 are attacked in the space of 2 months alone in 1960. There are even armed rebellions, about 12 of them in 1960, just for the south west provinces around Yunnan. In one case, for instance, in Xuanwei, about 100 farmers take weapons with the support of local village leaders and a number of high-ranking party officials. And the army has to be sent in to deal with that incident. And the further you go, the more rebellions you encounter. Some of them extremely violent, others really relying on the sheer strength of numbers of farmers. For instance, in Gansu province in January 1961, there are a reported 500 cases of assaults on freight trains. In one case, up to 4,000 farmers just wait by the side of that railway. Here comes the freight train. They assault it, remove every removable piece of property from that freight train. A number of them actually find military uniforms. And this is very cold, January 1961. They put them on the prowl a couple of days later. They approach a state granary. The doors open magically. Because, of course, the guards in control mistake them for militia. So there are all sorts of extraordinary acts of resistance that happen, from single farmers who simply can't take it anymore and assault officials with cleavers, to large gatherings of farmers who use their numbers to get to a train, get to a granary, or even assault an office that represents the Communist Party.
If you could stand up, but yeah.
Howard Friedman, United Nations. One of the things that I think was most poignant about what you had raised was the idea of all the violence, which is not something that I've heard people discuss that much. Can you give us an idea of roughly what percentage of the deaths you would say were associated with violent death as opposed to starvation?
Yes, it's an extremely interesting question. I'm very glad you raised it. Again, on the basis of a whole series of very different types of documentation, one gets a rough sense of how many died in violent conditions, how many were tortured to death, buried alive. Why? Because some of these investigation teams actually want to find out for themselves. So they come up with a number of figures, and it ranges from about 6 to 8%. It could be less, it could be more. But it means that about 2 to 3 million people were violently killed during this period. As a percentage, that is actually higher than the number of people who were killed deliberately under Pol Pot. Most of the victims under Pol Pot died of deliberate starvation and overwork in the countryside. So it's a quite high number. And even more interesting is, of course, the use of food as a weapon. Why beat somebody? Why expend energy when you can simply ban that person from the canteen? If you are too weak, too old, too sick to work, or if you speak out during a meeting or steal some grain, you will be banned from the canteen and you will starve very quickly. So the deliberate starving of people considered to be unfit or undesirable is one of the key characteristics of this famine. And in a number of counties in Sichuan, it is estimated that about 80% of those who died actually died because they were banned, cut off from the food supply. A very large number, although of course it varies enormously from one place to another. But I think it's fair to say that a good proportion of those who died were actually deliberately starved. The food is in the canteen. There are no pots and pans left. They were either collectivized or they were taken away during that movement to produce more steel in backyard furnaces. To even light a fire is seen as a counter-revolutionary act. The food is in the hands of the party, of the militia. It's handed out by the spoonful. One man we interviewed had a very interesting way of looking at it. He said that even if you worked hard, even if you got enough work points to be entitled to your bowl of food, he was still afraid to enter the canteen. As he said it, the ladle can read people's faces. By that he meant that the man who yields the ladle would either go very deep into the pot and give you some substantial food, or merely skim the surface and give you some greenish concoction if he didn't like you.
We have time for a couple more. How about right up here in the front?
Martha Springer, I would like to ask you about the book Mao, the Untold Story, the Unknown Story, which you're probably familiar with, and I think many of the conclusions, at least regarding this period, are similar to what you've concluded.
It's a very difficult question. You may have noticed that Yongzhang actually endorses the book. It's on the cover. It's been very much criticized. I have a very simple attitude. I like to see what is good in something. Now, Andrew Nathan, in a review, I believe, for the New York Review of Books, described that particular biography as bits of plastic and bits of jade. Well, I would rather focus on the jade and take that. I don't have time for the plastic. I can take the jade. I'm not one to go and jump up and down because I discovered another piece of plastic in that book. There's a lot of jade. I'd rather take that. The way I look at it, historiographically, so to speak, is that book has actually made it possible for others like myself to write about this period and about Mao in a much more critical manner. So I still believe that that book is fundamental from a historiographical point of view. And I keep on going back to it. I keep on going back to it. Now that I'm working on 1949 to 1957, I still go back to chapters. I read once, twice, check the footnotes. Of course there's plastic, there's still a lot of jade in there. And what else is there to read on that period? Not an awful lot.
So some of it is exaggeration, or it's not as contains insufficient research, or is the result of insufficient research? I don't know.
It seems to me my biggest reservation is as follows. It portrays Mao as a monster, which he was. But it doesn't really look at all the others who were there to support Mao, all the others who were there at key points to make sure that he got his way, all those who stood behind him and supported him. For instance, during the purge in Lushan in the summer of 1959, people like the mayor of Shanghai, Ke Qingshi, who stood right behind him, and others like Li Qingquan, the man who was in charge of Sichuan, was also very much a gung-ho supporter. So that's also what I've been trying to do in this book, move away from a narrow focus on Mao to look at how this affects not just everybody in the party, but human beings at every level, if you wish, of the social hierarchy, and how it creates moral degradations all the way through the moral fabric of the society.
I think we have time for one final question.
I'm Zach. You mentioned before about you got some emails from the mainland. People were waiting for the translation of your book. When is that going to be published, and will it be in Taiwan or Hong Kong, or will it be censored in any way?
It will be published in Hong Kong, and hopefully it should be out by January, February at the latest, so quite soon, within half a year. It will be, of course, in complex characters, but I've no doubt that once it will be published in complex characters, somebody else will copy it in simple characters. It will be scanned and copied and downloadable from the web.
Maybe we can have one last question.
As the Great Leap Forward developed, could you speak a little bit further about the roles of Liu Shaoxi and Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, especially when they started getting reports back from former cadres of theirs from the revolution, which was just 10 years ago, and from their relatives in the village, what was happening, both about the losses of life and the fabrications of crops. And also one last thing, if you could just mention a little about cannibalism.
I'll give you, because there's not much time left, but I'll give you a quotation from Deng Xiaoping. This is what he said in 1962, when he was fully aware of the fact that in his home province, Sichuan, 8 to 10 million people had died. Well, he said that he admired the Sichuan style, because when a command was issued by the center, Sichuan province actually delivered the goods. So he said that maybe there were some excesses in Sichuan, but overall he was proud of Sichuan. That's what he said in 1962, fully aware of the amount of deprivation and death caused by Li Qingquan, his man in Sichuan. Li Qingquan himself said, again in 1962, we are not weaker, we are stronger. Li Qingquan compared it to the Long March. He said, we have kept the backbone. By that he meant all those who had died unnecessarily were actually bad elements, slackers, deviationists, counter-revolutionaries, rightist conservatives. He had kept the backbone. That was a good thing. So the beauty of gaining access in a very limited way, to some of those minutes of top leadership speeches and conferences, to find out that it wasn't just one man's show, so to speak. He got a lot of support from the crucial people at the top, including Liu Shaoqi in the beginning, including Zhou Enlai after a couple of months. Zhou Enlai, well, here is somebody who Mao really needs to actually implement that plan. Once you decide that you're going to have a great leap forward, once you have that vision, there has to be somebody to do the paperwork. And Zhou Enlai was very good at it. And again, this is something that comes out of the archives, namely that Zhou Enlai is the one who goes around and will make sure that each province actually contributes the amount of grain that has been mandated from above. Here's a man who sends telegram after telegram, will harass people in personal meetings, will pressure, push to make sure that the grain is actually delivered. There is a very short chapter on cannibalism. And the beauty here of the archives is that there are a number of cases where it's not just a few cases, but a very systematic list of how many people committed cannibalism in one particular village. I have only one conclusion about cannibalism, namely that most people who had seen so much violence and horror and who had managed to survive through it all, well, for them surely this was not the worst form of disrespect and desecration, to eat somebody who had already died. Far greater horrors were inflicted on human beings by party members.
Is there, just so that we don't end on that note, is there anything that that we haven't asked you that you wish we had asked you about the book?
I would like to point out that I'd like to come back to what I said earlier about people being reduced to mere numbers. This is not a book of statistics. Numbers are important, but it's vital, I think, that one should try as a historian to really discover the human faces, the tragedies, the stories behind all of that. And I spend a lot of time trying to make this book as engaging as possible. If only because it's a book that's it's a topic that's far too important to be reduced to a mere theory about state power or this or that. It's far too important to be reduced to a mere number about how many people died. It has to be a part of something that people will read in order to gain the same level of knowledge about this great crime against humanity as they might gain from reading books, for instance, by Saul Friedlander on the Holocaust, or other books on the crimes committed under Stalin. So please don't be repelled by numbers. There are very few of them in the book.
And although it wasn't intended that way, that's actually a perfect introduction to invite you all to the back of the room, where, if you like, you can purchase a copy of the book and then ask any other questions you have to Professor Dikotter. Thanks for being such a thoughtful audience.
Thank you for coming.
Frank Dikotter is the Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. For more information, visit his website, web.mac.com/Dikotter.
John Dower is the author of Cultures of War, Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima.